Welcome back to the Risky Business podcast number 4, where we're going to talk about the real-world risks organisations face before they become headlines, complaints, or court matters. Today, we're talking about something many leaders watch from a distance and think, that could never happen here, until it does. You may have seen recent media coverage about the Jackie and Kyle workplace issues, which are currently before the courts. There'll be many opposing views. Kyle was hired to do what Kyle does. But on the other hand, is that a fair, legal and way to treat a co-worker? We're not here to relitigate the case, speculate on outcomes or take sides. That's not our role. But what we are here to do is ask a different question. How do workplace issues escalate from internal concerns to legal disputes? And what can organisations learn before they're in the same position? Because once something reaches a courtroom, the risks multiply. The legal risks, reputational damage, internal morale issues, loss of trust, inside and outside the organisation. And often, the warning signs were there long before escalation. Cases like this remind us of a hard truth. Workplace culture, conduct complaints, and leadership behaviour are no longer internal matters alone. They sit at the intersection of employment law, WHS and psychosocial safety obligations, modern workplace expectations, media scrutiny and public trust. If your policies are outdated, if your managers aren't trained, if complaints aren't handled properly, you don't just have a HR problem, you have a risk management problem. And this is where internal investigations, policy reviews and independent oversight become critical. As always, to help unpack this, I'm joined by Dave D and Dave O, who bring deep experience in governance, investigations and organisational risks. So without getting into the specifics of the Jackie and Kyle matter, what we often see in cases that end up in court is a failure to act early. So Dave D, I'll start with you. From your experience, what are the early warning signs that a workplace issue is moving from manageable to high risk?
Yeah, thanks, Emma, and good morning, everyone. Early warning signs that a workplace issue is moving from manageable to high risk are rarely dramatic at first. More often, they appear as a pattern of small signals that leaders choose to minimise, rationalise, or postpone. And we used to see this quite a lot in our time at Professional Standards, Emma.
Yeah.
In the context of ethical leadership, which I'm currently teaching in our master's program of strategic leadership in risk and emergency management at UNE, we discuss this as a form of ethical drift, the gradual normalisation of behaviour that should have triggered intervention earlier. And to the point, it sounds like that's what's happened with Kyle and Jackie. Once leaders stop acting or act inconsistently, they're not remaining neutral. They are sending a message that the conduct is tolerable, and in doing so, they help reset the organisation's moral boundary. Some of the clearest early warning signs include repeated low-level complaints, behavioural issues being explained away because a person is high-performing or senior, again, sounds something similar to what we're talking about, increasing reluctance by staff to speak up, visible inconsistency on how standards are applied, and a growing gap between stated values and everyday conduct. Other signs include defensiveness when concerns are raised, informal workarounds, replacing proper process, silence bystanders, and leaders privately acknowledging a problem but failing to address it formally. These are all indicators that the issue is no longer simply interpersonal or isolated. It is beginning to become cultural, systemic, and therefore higher risk. The shift into high risk usually occurs when the consequence broadens beyond the original behaviour itself. At that point, the issue starts to affect trust, psychological safety, reporting culture, staff well-being, governance credibility, and organisational legitimacy. In workplace management terms, the problem has escalated from a contained issue to one with wider operational and ethical consequences. That is why ethical leadership requires early recognition and timely action. If you do not act on something you know is wrong, you are not preserving stability, you are teaching the organisation what is prepared to accept. And when I was putting that response together, it does sound a lot like what we're talking about with Kyle and Jackie O. Like, obviously, I don't know all the facts, but certainly from an outsider looking in, it resonates with me.
Yeah, and as you touched on in our past lives, we definitely saw this at the organisation we were at. And one thing organisations often say is, well, we have policies in place. And as we've seen in our experience, courts don't just look at what's written, they look at what is actually done. So, Davo, let me put this to you. where do organisations most commonly fail when it comes to policies versus real world practice?
Yeah, the theme of we have policies in place is one of the biggest gaps we see. And you'd be surprised, it's actually consistent across the different industries where we do our investigations or fact finding inquiries. You'll find most organisations don't fail because they don't have policies. They actually fail because there is the disconnect between what's written and what happens day by day. And that's what you say, actually living it and showing it in everything that you do. So if you look at the things we commonly break down, there are some patterns we see across the board. So the first of those is policies that exist for compliance, not for actual people. So they're actually written in legal or HR language, but they're not translated into real behaviours. So frontline managers don't know how to apply them in a messy and real world situations. And that's what you're generally faced with. Secondly, training becomes tick in the box exercise. So people might complete an annual module, but that doesn't build confidence in handling a complaint. Having a difficult conversation, and we found people have lost that ability or how to escalate an issue properly. So then there's a lack of accountability. People know the policy exists, it's there, it's in writing, but no one is clearly responsible for enforcing it. And there's often hesitation when the issue involves a high performer or senior leader. And we've seen that not only in the Kyle and Jackie O case, if we look at the casinos that were before a Royal Commission, high performers who were bringing money into the organisation, yet their behaviour was not ethical and subject to investigations, but they're performing high. They're bringing money in. Do we really want to go there? And fourth, and this is a really big one, aid or poorly handled complaints. So organisations, they sit on issues, they downplay them, or they try to resolve them informally without proper processes. That delay creates legal exposure for them, and it's a signal that the behaviour is actually going to be tolerated. The next one is weak investigation processes. So if investigations lack independence, procedural fairness, and proper documentation, they don't just fail internally, they actually increase the organisation's legal and regulatory risks. I don't know how many times Dave and I and Emma, you as well, have done investigations where you ask for record keeping and their record keeping is atrocious and there's no follow through. So even when the organisations actually identify issues, they don't always track the action, they don't monitor the patterns, they don't record the meetings, and they don't fix systemic problems. So it's the same behaviours that keep resurfacing. So when you step back, the actual behaviour to the question is pretty clear. It's really the absence of a policy that causes problems. It's the failure to embed policy into culture, leadership behaviour, and everyday decision making. Now, that's where issues start small and then they end up having to call us in or we end up in court.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important to talk about leadership here as well. Dave D, how much does leadership behaviour in the first 48 hours influence whether an issue escalates or stabilises?
Yeah, thanks, Emma. Look, leadership, I don't think can be understated in any of this conversation. It's at the forefront of everything that happens in an organisation. Leadership, and the old terminology, the behaviour you walk past is the behaviour you accept, and leaders set the tone, and then that first 48 hours. It's often decisive in determining whether workplace conduct issues escalate or stabilise.
Yeah.
In many cases, that early period sets the tone for everything that follows. People are watching, are always watching a leader. When you walk into any room, when you take notes, when you say something, it's always being watched. It's always being monitored. And leaders should know this and understand that in their environment. Um, if it tells staff really what matters, what will be tolerated, and whether organisation values have any practical meaning when tested. So a failure to act or an overly cautious, minimising or defensive response can normalise the behaviour and allow the issue to widen. When leaders delay, stay silent, or send mixed messages, they often believe they are containing the problem, but in reality, they may be creating uncertainty, eroding trust, and signalling that standard are negotiable. This is how a manageable conduct issue starts to become a broader cultural and governance problem. By contrast, strong leadership in the first 48 hours does not mean rushing to judgment. It means establishing control, recognising the seriousness of the concern, and protecting those involved, clarifying process, preserving fairness, and making it clear that the matter will be addressed properly. Early leadership behaviour shapes confidence, reporting, culture, and organisational legitimacy. In practical terms, the first 48 hours are not just administrative, they are ethical and symbolic. They often determine whether people believe the organisation is capable of acting with integrity under pressure. So, yeah, again, it resonates with a lot of stuff that we see when we're doing investigations.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be great, Dave, if we came in to do the investigations and they actually document what they do and their meetings and the resolve of it, or simply followed up with an email? Thanks for the discussion, this time, date and place, and agreement to do 1, 2 and 3. Or thank you for highlighting this point with me. The actions we are taking are A, B and C, and then they actually follow up with them. Because we generally get matters, don't we, 2 and 3 years old, and
Mm.
you go back and ask for records in, 2023. Can you remember a conversation? You're a lot better than me if you can remember that conversation verbatim.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Absolutely.
I was just actually on the phone to someone before this podcast recording, and he fell foul of his employer recently for swearing. He works in the medical industry, and for swearing in the workplace. But he's been doing that for years. But all of a sudden, they've decided that there's the line in the sand. And it goes to that sending a message, and then he's gone, well, hang on, I've been doing this for years. I'm not swearing at, and people just swearing under his breath in frustration. But, changing the goalpost is very, very hard as a leader.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, the line, we've always done it this way, doesn't always cut it. But it is a factor, right? Like if it's been accepted for all that time, should it be accepted? And this comes up constantly. So, Davo, how risky is the mindset of we've always handled things this way, particularly when laws and expectations evolve faster than organisations do?
Yeah, look, I think it's probably the riskiest mindset in today's environment. And it's probably one of the most dangerous cultural signals that Dave addressed as an organisation that you can have. Because what the phrase usually means is we stop questioning whether what we're doing is still appropriate.
Yeah.
So the problem is the external environment doesn't stand still. We've seen the major shifts in work health and safety laws, psychosocial safety obligations, expectations, workplace behaviour and respect, how regulators assess reasonable employer actions, and the speed at which issues now become public through social media platforms. So something that might have been tolerated or quietly managed 5 or 10 years ago can now create real legal exposure. So look, there's a few specific risks with that mindset. The first is the legal risk. Court and regulators don't accept. That's the way we've always done it as a defence. It's not a defence. They look at whether your actions reflect current standards, not historical ones. Then you look at the blind spots. When organisations rely on legacy practice, they often miss early warning signs because those behaviours have been normalised internally. Oh, that's just Dave, or that's just Emma, and
Mm.
that's the way they behave. So it's a blind spot to them. Inconsistency in decision making. You've got to set a benchmark. You'll hear a lot of companies talk about. So what used to be handed informally now might require a structured investigation. But if leaders aren't adapting, you get uneven responses, which is what creates another whole new different dispute. And then you've got cultural drift. So you end up with a gap between what the organisation stands for and what people actually experience. And they compare and contrast. So when that trust erodes internally first and then externally, and that's not good. So the mindset shifts as the organisation becomes proactive to being reactive. You're not managing risk as it is, you're waiting for something to go wrong. So the real question you should be asked is, have we always handled it this way? You should actually look at, would we be comfortable as an organisation defending how we handled this today in front of a regulator or court? What would they think? What would their decision be? And that's the important one.
Yeah. And
Just on that, Dave,
there you
I
go.
was just thinking, sorry, Emma. The other thing we haven't spoken about, but is true to this conversation, is having a difficult conversation.
Mm-hmm.
People are not able to have a difficult conversation, and Emma, we see it in the client that we're both working with at the moment, is the inability for senior people to have difficult conversations with people, and that then goes to all the things that Dave was just talking about with ethical drift and cultural drift and all that sort of stuff. and drawing a line in the sand and sitting with someone and then having that conversation. And yeah, it's awkward. It is an acquired skill for
Mm,
leaders, but it's something leaders need to take at the forefront and learn how to have that difficult conversation and set the boundaries, put your line in the sand, and say this is what I accept and this is what I don't accept.
absolutely. You've got to prevent things from festering. And I think people just naturally don't like confrontation. Some do, some don't. But the
But
reality
that
is,
it's
it's what, yeah,
sorry, Em, I was gonna say
yeah.
that in itself, what Dave's saying, is an issue because a lot of the investigations that we do that come through, people haven't been managed for years,
Mm-hmm.
so there is no standards that they have to meet. And then all of a sudden, somebody who comes in who is actually a really good manager, and they're the ones that are subject to complaints. Oh, they're micromanaging me. Oh, they're holding me to account. Oh, they put me on a performance agreement. You know, my previous manager didn't have an issue with me. No, because they didn't want to have the difficult conversations. But now
Yeah.
somebody who is actually really good at their job comes in, they're subject to these complaints. So it's actually, for senior managers, it's vital to get people in, i.e., independent people in, to actually support the managers in their decision. And if they're doing wrong, you don't want them in the organisation anyway. That's
Yeah.
fine. But
Yeah.
let's support those who are actually doing the right thing and having those difficult conversations.
Absolutely. Yeah. Couldn't agree more. I mean, the reality is laws change, community expectations shift. What once was banter may now be legally framed as a psychosocial hazard, and we've seen plenty of those examples over the years. What used to be called banter and used to be funny, even look at TV shows. The Footy Show, for example, in the 90s. I put that on for my kids the other day, and I didn't realize how not woke it is. It's really inappropriate, but at the time, I didn't think anything of it, and my kids are mortified. So it changes over time. The definition of banter, and I think that's really important. And organisations need to stay in tune with the law. It's just not optional anymore. So especially with strengthened WHS obligations, increased focus on respectful workplaces. That's a big one. Personal liability for officers and directors. So policy that hasn't been reviewed in years is not a safety net. It's a liability. And this is why at Risky, we see how important it is to offer policy and process reviews. So if your organisation is asking, does our misconduct process still comply with current law? Would our investigations stand up in court? Are our managers actually equipped to handle complaints? Then it's time to review your policies before something goes wrong. And that's whether you use an independent organisation or do it yourselves. It's really important to continue to review your policies. A proactive review ends up being cheaper, faster, and far less damaging than litigation. But sometimes, despite the best intentions, internal processes lose credibility or shouldn't be run internally at all. So, Dave D, in your view, when should an organisation step back and engage an independent investigation?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and it's something sort of we sometimes see that it's gone through an internal process and then it gets handed to us to fix up, if you like. And then there's other organisations that believe that they can do investigations, and I'm talking about legal firms who I've done a couple of reviews for legal firms that have conducted investigations which have been done very, very poorly. So the first point is skills and capability. Do you have the skills and capability internally to do a proper investigation that's going to hold up in some sort of tribunal, court place, or whatever the case may be, and is fair? The other thing is, can we do it internally impartially? Are we going to be fair,
Yeah.
or are we going to bring our own organisational bias into the investigation? And again, I think it's where you want to end up with this process. So if you believe you're going to end up with a termination or some sort of other uh, serious management action, then you really got to ask these hard questions. I'm not suggesting, for a verbal warning or something that you need to go through a full investigation process, because you don't. But certainly, impartiality is the one of the key factors. Credibility is another. Is this done by Dave Donahue, who works for X company, and is it going to be a credible investigation? And the last one, and Dave touched on it before, is can we do it quickly? So a lot of people just aren't sitting around waiting for an investigation to hit on the lap. They've got their own job to do when they do it, and they're busy, 8 to 10 hours a day or whatever they work. And it just trying to do an investigation through BAU is very, very difficult for organisations. And that's one of the key things that, the three of us are representing is if we get an investigation, we get stuck into it straight away
Yeah.
and we try and knock it over. And I don't want to steal any thunder. You'll talk about paying executive salaries, Dave, but you got to get into these investigations, and you can't have witnesses, victims, and complainants sitting there waiting for an investigation for 3 to 6 months to take fruition. And I think that's the important questions that organisational leaders need to ask themselves when they're looking at getting someone external to do their investigations.
Yeah.
The other one I laugh at, Dave, is when companies get, and I shouldn't use the word laugh, but I do, because when they give it to someone to investigate their boss, oh, how's that working for you career-wise? Like, how can you possibly investigate somebody senior to you, because there's going to be ramifications down the track.
Yep.
Whether there is or isn't, that's always playing in the back of your mind.
Yeah. And Davo, building on that, what do you think an independent investigation brings to an internal process that an internal process often can't?
Yeah, look, I think it changes the credibility both internally and externally. One of the biggest risks is it's not what you find, it's whether people actually believe that the process was fair. So if it's internally, you've got the perception of bias. Even if the internal investigators act professionally, there's often that bias perception that comes into it. Externally, we have the freedom to follow the evidence. We're not worried about team dynamics, protected organisational history, or how things are usually handled. We can get in, we can test the assumptions, we can ask the harder questions without constraint. Procedural rigour is another. Independent investigators, we're very well structured, clear terms of reference, proper evidence handling, documented interviews or recorded interviews. You'd be amazed how many we see where they say, look, we conducted an interview. Well, where's the recording, or where are your notes? Oh, here's a synopsis of it. That's not how it's done. And we make sure there's procedural fairness for all parties. Remember, it's not just the complainant, but it's the person complained of, because it may or may not be substantiated. And it's also external protection for the organisation. The independent process demonstrates that the organisation took it really seriously and responded appropriately. And trust. Independence doesn't just strengthen the investigation, it actually strengthens confidence. So employees are saying this will be handled fairly. The leadership, it provides defensible findings. We always do, and we always point to the evidence that it does. And it's about transparency and accountability. So I don't think you can beat, yes, it's business, but I don't think you can beat appointing an independent investigator who has all of those and can protect the organisation.
Yeah. And I'll put this next question to both of you to finish. If organisations could change just one thing today to reduce the risk of ending up in court, what should it be?
Look, I've got 2 words, and that's the answer: be consistent. And let's have a look at Kyle and Jackie O. And again, we don't know all the facts, and probably never will. And I don't really care about the outcome, to be honest. Perfectly honest, the amount of money they're talking about is disgusting. But at the end of the day, be consistent. So that's what you hired Kyle Sandilands for: is to be controversial, leading the edge, and then what's that tipping point? And all the things we've discussed today from a leadership perspective and behaviour, walk past and all that sort of stuff. You could play 100 clips of Kyle doing interviews with people and his disrespectful attitude and, pushing that boundary all the time. And, take to what has been shown in the media to the tipping point for Jackie O walking off the point. That, to me, doesn't sound like anything he hasn't said 100 times before on the radio. So I'm going to go out on a limb and say that I think Kyle will win his unfair dismissal because they haven't been consistent. The radio has not been consistent with their leadership, their messaging, their attitude, the behaviour they walk past for years, and then all of a sudden they get to this point. So I think they're going to really fall down in that consistency side.
Yeah.
2 words: Geez. It's not an easy subject. Look, I think the biggest thing is having managers, leaders act properly. Now, by that, I mean you listen without dismissing or minimising. You escalate something when it actually reaches a threshold, not when it becomes, oh, I've got no choice, I've got to do it. Use a structure and fair process. And the biggest thing of all is documentation all the way along. Document your decisions, document your findings, document any emails, correspondence, anything you can rely on, because people's memory changes to suit the situation that they're in. And it might be their honest opinion that something occurred when in fact it didn't.
Absolutely. So what cases like the Jackie and Cole matter remind of us is this. The real risk isn't the complaint, it's how you respond to it. When responses are slow, offensive, poorly documented, or legally uninformed, issues will escalate. Our message is simple. Stay aligned with the law, review your policies regularly, act early, and when independence is needed, don't hesitate to bring it in. Because once your issue is being discussed in public or in court, you're no longer managing risk, you're reacting to it. We're always happy to help review your workplace policies, sense check your investigation processes, or conduct an independent investigation when things don't work out internally. So reach out. A conversation now can prevent a crisis later. Thanks for listening to our Risky Business podcast, and thank you, Dave, for joining me.
Thanks, Sam.
Thank you.
Thanks,
We'll
Sam.
see you next time.
See ya.